In this gripping and eye-opening narrative, we dive into a shocking and profound encounter between a flight attendant and a black billionaire. What begins as an ordinary flight quickly escalates into a tense situation that challenges the very essence of humility, respect, and understanding. The flight attendant's prejudiced remark, made in ignorance of the passenger's true identity, sets the stage for a powerful lesson that will leave you questioning assumptions and stereotypes. If you find this story as riveting as we believe it to be, press 1 to express your enthusiasm. If you disagree, press 0. Your feedback is crucial and inspires us to continue creating more impactful and transformative stories. Sebastian Dixon, a distinguished billionaire, entered the first-class cabin of the airplane with an air of quiet dignity. At 60 years old, his worn hands tightly gripped a leather briefcase that had traveled alongside him through many years of his life. His graying hair and soft, thoughtful eyes spoke of a man who had experienced life's challenges and emerged victorious. Despite his immense wealth, Sebastian's appearance was far from ostentatious. Dressed in a simple light gray suit, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a humble neighbor. As he made his way down the aisle, he greeted fellow passengers with a friendly nod, his smile putting them at ease, many unaware that they were sitting next to one of the wealthiest men in the country. Sebastian, however, preferred it that way. He never sought attention or desired the lavish spotlight that accompanied his success. A quiet man of substance, he valued modesty over flaunting his fortune. Finding his seat, he carefully stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment before sinking into the plush leather chair with a sigh of relief. The day had been long, filled with critical meetings, difficult decisions, and weighty responsibilities, and all he yearned for now was a few hours of peaceful solitude. A flight attendant, Bethany, approached with a forced smile, her voice professional but devoid of warmth. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" she asked. "Just water, please." Sebastian replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he added, his tone still calm and composed as the attendant moved away. As the hum of the plane's engines grew louder, Sebastian glanced out the window, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him here. From humble beginnings, he had never imagined that one day he would not only be able to afford first-class travel, but also own a company that would provide him the means to do so. His mind wandered back to the difficulties he had overcome, each obstacle shaping him into the person he had become. But more than the wealth or accolades, what truly fulfilled him was the good he had been able to do in the world. His philanthropic efforts, helping those less fortunate, brought him far more joy than any luxury ever could. With a peaceful heart, he opened a book from his carry-on bag, hoping to lose himself in its pages during the flight. For a moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. Little did he know, however, that this seemingly calm flight was about to take a dramatic turn. As the last few passengers settled into their seats, Sebastian remained unaware of the events that were unfolding around him. But then, as fate would have it, his moment of tranquility was disrupted by Bethany, the flight attendant, who walked toward him with a suspicious look in her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice suddenly colder and more authoritative. "I think you may have wandered into the wrong cabin. The economy section is further back." Sebastian looked up, surprised by the sudden confrontation. With a friendly smile, he replied, "No, ma'am. I'm in the right place. My seat is here." Bethany's expression faltered for a moment before she replied sharply, "I'm going to need to see your ticket." Sebastian, though taken aback by her tone, remained composed. He had faced such discrimination before, though it never got easier. Calmly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his ticket, and handed it to her without uttering a word. Bethany took the ticket, but rather than simply verifying it, she scrutinized it under the light as if looking for a reason to doubt its authenticity. Her actions grew increasingly suspicious, and the other passengers began to watch with growing discomfort. "Is there a problem?" Sebastian asked, his voice steady despite the very public questioning. Bethany raised an eyebrow. "This ticket seems unusual. I'll need to verify it with the gate agent," she insisted. Sebastian, though hurt by her dismissive attitude, remained patient. "Take all the time you need, I assure you. Everything is in order." As Bethany walked away, her steps quick and deliberate, Sebastian leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought about the long road he had traveled to reach this point. Life had been filled with hurdles, but each setback had strengthened him. This moment, though frustrating, was simply another opportunity to show grace in the face of ignorance. Bethany returned, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Well, it seems the ticket is valid," she said, handing it back to him. "But there must be some mistake. Surely you meant to book a seat in coach." Sebastian's patience, which had been unwavering until now, began to wear thin. "There's no mistake, ma'am," he replied firmly. "This is my seat, and I have every right to be here." The flight attendant's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and she looked around at the other passengers who had been silently watching the exchange. Her frustration grew as the stares of the passengers intensified. "Sir," she hissed, "I must insist that you lower your voice. You're being disrespectful to me and to the other passengers in first class." Sebastian blinked in disbelief, his calm demeanor unshaken. He hadn't raised his voice at all. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Bethany's hand shot through the air and struck him across the face. The slap rang out through the cabin, shocking everyone in the vicinity. A collective gasp echoed around the plane as Sebastian's head jerked to the side from the force of the blow. The entire cabin fell into stunned silence as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Passengers stared, mouths agape, some reaching for their phones, while others whispered urgently to one another. Sebastian, though visibly shaken by the slap, remained still and composed. His hand gently touched his stinging cheek, but his eyes remained steady and full of resolve. He looked at Bethany, who stood frozen, her hand still raised in disbelief as she began to grasp the gravity of her actions. "Why did you slap me?" Sebastian asked calmly, his voice barely above a whisper. Bethany, her face flushed with guilt and shame, stammered, "You were being disrespectful. This is first class, and there are standards to maintain." Sebastian shook his head slowly, disbelief still evident on his face. But before he could respond, a notification pinged on his phone. Glancing down, he saw a message that caused his eyebrows to raise. It was from his company's legal team, confirming that they had just finalized the purchase of the airline's parent company, an acquisition he had been working on for months. A subtle smile played at the corner of his mouth as he carefully put his phone away. The plane began to taxi for takeoff, but Sebastian's mind was already working. In that moment, he knew that the situation with Bethany was more than just an unfortunate encounter. It was an opportunity for change. He would use this experience and his new position of influence to create a more just and respectful environment within the airline. As the flight progressed, Sebastian observed Bethany's interactions with other passengers. He noted how she avoided his section of the cabin, how she was overly attentive to some passengers but distant to others, especially those of color. With each passing moment, the picture of Bethany's prejudices became clearer. Sebastian's frustration grew as he sifted through the countless complaints, each one painting a damning picture of the airline's culture. He noted how many passengers, particularly those of color, had been subjected to disrespectful treatment. It was clear that the issue was systemic, not just an isolated incident involving Bethany. His mind raced, pondering the scale of the task ahead. He knew this wouldn't be an easy fix. A corporate culture as entrenched as this would require more than a few changes in policy or management. It needed a complete transformation, a shift in how people were treated, how they treated others, and how they viewed their roles within the airline. Sebastian took a deep breath and reminded himself why he had purchased the airline in the first place, to make a meaningful impact. This wasn't just about fixing a business. It was about creating a legacy that would improve the lives of passengers and employees alike, making travel a better experience for everyone, regardless of race, background, or appearance. He leaned back in his chair, thinking through his next steps. A new kind of leadership was needed, one that would model empathy and inclusivity from the top down. He was ready to take on the challenge. As the days passed, the internal investigation into Bethany's conduct progressed quietly but steadily. While the airline's leadership team worked on new policies, training programs, and guidelines for inclusion, they also conducted interviews with passengers and flight attendants who had witnessed or been affected by Bethany's behavior. The process was thorough, but Sebastian knew it would take time to address the deeper cultural issues within the company. Bethany, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the gravity of the situation. She continued her work, still firmly believing that her actions were justified. She thought she had done nothing wrong, simply enforcing the standards of first-class service. However, her growing discomfort was evident as whispers about the investigation and the upcoming sensitivity training sessions spread among her colleagues. One morning, a letter appeared in her locker. It was an official notice informing her of a mandatory cultural sensitivity training session. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She scoffed at the idea of being singled out, her pride bruised. She had been a flight attendant for over a decade, and the suggestion that she needed to learn how to treat passengers seemed absurd. But as she made her way through the rest of her day, the notice gnawed at her and doubts began to creep in. At the same time, Sebastian was planning his next moves carefully. He had already decided that simply addressing Bethany's behavior wouldn't be enough. She was merely a symptom of a much larger issue. The real work was going to be addressing the systemic problems that allowed such discrimination to thrive. Sebastian's plan was simple: launch a comprehensive training program, conduct a full review of the airline's practices, and ensure that no one, regardless of their background or appearance, would ever again feel humiliated or marginalized by the airline staff. He worked closely with his team to refine these initiatives, ensuring that they would make a lasting impact. The new policies would set the tone for a complete overhaul, one that would prioritize inclusivity, empathy, and respect for every single passenger. While the process of change was well underway, neither Bethany nor the rest of the airline staff could have predicted the profound shift that was about to occur. Sebastian knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to see it through. After all, it was not just about correcting past wrongs. It was about forging a new future for the airline, one that would be defined by dignity and respect for all. Bethany nodded, her throat dry as she stood in front of the camera. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. She had been avoiding facing the reality of her actions for so long, but now she had no choice. Every colleague, every supervisor, and even the higher-ups, including Sebastian, would be watching. The idea of exposing her past mistakes to so many people made her want to shrink into the ground. But she knew she had to do it. This was her chance, her only chance, to prove that she could change. "Just take a deep breath," the technician said with a reassuring smile, sensing her nerves. "You'll do great." Bethany nodded again, but her heart was still pounding in her chest. She looked around the room, at the faces of her fellow flight attendants, some of whom had been quietly watching her every move since the investigation began. Their silent judgment stung, and she felt more exposed than ever before. But she had to speak, to admit what she'd done, and, most importantly, to show that she understood why it was wrong. Mina, the trainer from the cultural sensitivity session, gave her an encouraging nod from the corner of the room, and Bethany turned her attention back to the camera. She cleared her throat, her hands trembling as she adjusted her uniform one last time. "Hello," she began, her voice faltering at first. "My name is Bethany Williams, and I've been a flight attendant for over 12 years. She paused, looking directly into the camera as she gathered her thoughts. "I've been asked to speak today about my actions, about the mistakes I've made, and the lessons I've learned along the way." Bethany took another deep breath, the words feeling foreign as they left her mouth. "I've always prided myself on doing my job well, on maintaining standards, but over time, I've realized that those standards, my standards, were incomplete. I treated passengers differently based on how they looked, how they spoke, or how they carried themselves. And I'm ashamed of that." Her eyes briefly darted down, and she fought to steady her emotions. "I ignored the needs of certain passengers because I thought they didn't belong in first class, or because I assumed they didn't understand what was expected of them. I made judgments based on things that had nothing to do with their character or their worth. And I hurt people. I humiliated people. And for that, I am truly sorry." Bethany wiped at the corner of her eye, fighting the sting of tears that threatened to well up. I've been given the chance to reflect, to learn from those mistakes. It hasn't been easy. I've resisted, I've been defensive, and I've tried to justify my actions. But I know now that this wasn't just about doing my job. It was about how I treated people, how I made them feel. The room was silent as Bethany paused, trying to find the words to convey just how much she had come to understand. I've learned that respect and empathy are at the core of what we do as flight attendants. We're here to serve every passenger regardless of their background, their appearance, or the way they speak. I failed to see that, but I'm committed to changing. She straightened her back, looking at the camera with a renewed sense of purpose. I know that actions speak louder than words, and I want to prove that I can do better. I am committed to not only changing my own behavior, but also being a part of this airline's journey towards greater inclusivity and respect for all passengers. Bethany felt her heart racing, but she was no longer filled with fear. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. She could change. She could learn. And perhaps by opening up, she might inspire others to do the same. The technician signaled that her time was up, and Bethany took a final breath before stepping away from the camera. Her legs felt weak, but there was a sense of relief washing over her. She had spoken her truth, and now she had to live by it. As she left the room, she passed by several of her colleagues, including Lisa, who had been quietly observing her. The silence between them was heavy, but as Bethany walked past, Lisa gave her a small, tentative smile. It was a gesture of understanding, perhaps the beginning of forgiveness, or at least a sign that change could start with one person. Sebastian, meanwhile, watched the live stream from his office, his eyes locked on Bethany's every word. He had seen moments like this before, when someone confronted their own failings head-on and chose to change. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He could sense the weight in her voice, the vulnerability she was showing, and he knew that this could be the turning point not just for Bethany, but for the entire airline. As the broadcast ended, he leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet pride filling him. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much larger transformation, one that would take time, patience, and dedication. But Sebastian believed in the power of second chances, in the possibility of change, and most importantly, in the collective strength of his employees to build something better, together. This story of Bethany's transformation is deeply moving and filled with moments of growth, vulnerability, and redemption. Sebastian's decision to not only forgive Bethany but also empower her with an important role in the cultural transformation highlights the potential for growth in all of us.